Hi, let's continue. If you're new here, you can go to the trailer, or if you're lost, you can go to the table of contents. In this video, we're going to be looking at medications for bipolarity, but don't forget, there's a whole non-medication approach to the treatment of bipolarity and a whole um, playlist for that that I'm linking here. So don't forget that, as well as the medication approaches. So here's the whole menu. As you can see, as you go from left to right, you move away from antidepressants and toward these other options, and we're going to look at each one of these one at a time. First, I've emphasized the importance of thinking in terms of psychotherapy for plain or pure depressions because the efficacy is as good as antidepressants for most people with depression and anxiety. Uh, but from a medications point of view, it's antidepressants at this portion of the mood spectrum. And then antidepressants as you go into this mixed zone, not so clear. And then antidepressants at the other end of the mixed zone, very much not so clear as to what to do. And then finally, when you get to bipolar 2, depression plus up and down energy phases, you need an antidepressant that is also a mood stabilizer. So this actually ought to have a sort of an acronym unto its own. It ought to be called the mood stabilizers with antidepressant effects, or MSAEs, like SSRIs, or SNRIs. Um, and this is that group: lamotrigine, low-dose lithium, and lurasidone. That's kind of a handy three L's, right? Lamotrigine, low-dose lithium, and lurasidone. But quetiapine, named Seroquel, is another one that could be referred to in this group of MSAEs. Now, to round out this list, there are these anti-seizure medications, valproate and carbamazepine and its cousin oxcarbazepine. Now, I don't find these as reliable in terms of having an antidepressant effect, but they are stabilizers, and so they could be combined with some other antidepressant modality, like light therapy, for example, to make a combination stabilizer antidepressant. So how do you choose when you have like this group um, for this portion of the mood spectrum? Well, lurasidone and quetiapine have the best evidence for efficacy for being better than a placebo in randomized trials. But lamotrigine is clearly the least likely to do bad things like cause side effects and carry long-term risks. So, in my thinking, unless the depressions in this portion of the mood spectrum are really dire and dangerous, then I think it's important to think long-term, and lamotrigine comes out the leader when you think that way, in my opinion. And that's why I think lamotrigine is the answer when you think back across into those mixed states. What should we do here, antidepressants or lamotrigine? That's the debate that emerges, I think, in the farther back you go in the mixed state realm of the spectrum. Now, low dose lithium, what's that? Well, I think of it as a different drug compared to full dose lithium, but there's very limited research on it, particularly in this portion of the mood spectrum. Most of the research is on full dose lithium. There is a study showing that it didn't work all that well, but in my experience, it seemed to work really well. And there are other reasons to think about lithium. Um, a probable anti-suicide effect that hasn't been nailed down for sure, but seems pretty likely, and even a possible anti-dementia effect, which I discussed in another video on this channel. So it's clearly lower risk than full dose lithium, and that's why I think it deserves to be considered kind of alongside lamotrigine, and in my head, ahead of lurasidone and quetiapine. And lastly, for the full depression plus mania, the bipolar 1 portion of the spectrum, lithium is clearly the standard, but it doesn't work for everybody, and some people can't tolerate it. About 1% in 10 that's so dull and flat on it, you just give up at the beginning. That doesn't seem to get better with time and just gets worse as the dose goes up. But otherwise, lithium is now regarded as the mainstay for this portion of the mood spectrum, I think by most mood specialists around the world. Those anti-seizure medications are also part of the candidate for this list. Um, valproate's big name was Depakote, and carbamazepine and oxcarbazepine. I should mention these are generally regarded as not candidates at all for women of reproductive age because they can do damage to a developing fetus, even in the early phases of pregnancy before pregnancies are detected. So generally avoided now for women of reproductive age. And they're kind of like old school meds, I would use. I think you'll run into them less often with younger psychiatrists who are used to using the rest of the medications on this list, namely the so-called antipsychotics. Um, they're fast. They're commonly used in hospitals. They do have more long-term risks. There are two main groups, the so-called atypicals. They were atypical back in my day. They're kind of the typical ones, and then the newer ones beyond that. And choosing amongst these compared to lithium, that's a very complicated business. So just kind of laying out the options for you here, not necessarily steering you toward any particular one of those. So in summary, that's the menu of medications across the mood spectrum, at least as I see it. And eventually, for this playlist, I'll have a video on each one of those with more details. Um, and when there are a lot of them, you'll have to scroll to the right to actually see them all. Um, Otherwise, you can now go back to the table of contents.